that I've been able to find in here are right in this area. W.H. and Jane Merrill had 3 children that are buried here. 2 of them died in their birth years, one in 1832 and one in 1838. So I believe, well, for sure this is the oldest part of the cemetery, but I believe this is the oldest section of the oldest part. And something I think is pretty interesting here is this raised monument right here is the final resting place of Rene Stone. Now, Mr. Stone was born in 1780 and passed away in 1856. There are a number of Stone family graves in this area, and they date from the 1840s and 1850s. Now, I don't know if everybody's going to be able to see it or not, but if you look right down this way, there's an obelisk, and then there's a small monument and a large monument. If you can see that small monument, that's going to be our first look at Victorian symbolism today. The monument itself looks like a stack of rocks, and that stack of rocks represents a life built on a firm religious foundation, and you'll see that in Victorian type cemeteries. And we're going to walk right down here. We've got quite a bit of symbolism in this little group of monuments here, so let's walk down here and take a look at these.
That same
One monument right over here. It's kind of a tall one. It's got an open book on the top of it. And then this monument here, these 2 Turnbull monuments look a lot alike, but there are some notable differences. If you look on the front, you'll see gates that are opening up, and they're on all 3 of these monuments. And what that represents are the gates of heaven opening up. Now, there's some different symbols on here. The one over here on Hamilton, there's a crown above the opening gates, and that represents heavenly reward. Now, this monument here has a crown and cross, and that represents the serenity of the Lord in victory over death. And finally, this monument here has a 5-pointed star above those opening gates, and a 5-point star represents heavenly wisdom. Now, if you see these, this monument, and this one all have books, and they all look a little bit different, and all of them symbolize something very different. This monument over here has an open Bible. An open Bible represents perfect knowledge. Now, if you look at this book here, this is a closed book, and the spine is over here to the left, to where if you open this book, you would be at the very beginning of the book. That represents hidden knowledge. That'd be knowledge that we won't know until we get to heaven. Now, this closed book over here looks pretty much like this one, except for one thing. The spine is over on the right. So that's what a book would look like when you finish reading it and closed it up. And that represents a completed life. Now, we're going to head right on down this way.
Al?
Yes,
This marker seems to have something on the upper right-hand corner. What would that be?
Right here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's a shroud. And anytime you see a shroud on a Victorian cemetery, that represents grief.
Okay.
And we're going to head right on down this way. Where we're at right now was the final resting place of Paul Holmes Pascal, and you can see here he was an attorney. He was born in 1907 and passed away in 1990. In the class of 1925, he was the first honor graduate of Monroe High School, and in 1930 he was an honor graduate from the University of Georgia. Now, if you look at his headstone here, it mentions a number of things he was involved with. A lot of it had to do with the Methodist Church. He was on the North Georgia Methodist Conference of Missions. He was on the annual conference of the Methodist Church for many years. He was a Sunday school teacher, and if you look, he was also something of a historian. Now, the thing I think is the most interesting part of what he's got on here is at the very bottom. He was an author of a book, and the book was called This Trail of Splendor and Glory. Now, when he wrote this book, he kind of combined his faith and his love of history, and he wrote the history of the Monroe First United Methodist Church. He wrote this in 1974 at the 150th anniversary of the Methodist Church there. And we're going to head right down this way. If you look around in this area, there's a number of Confederate veterans that are buried here, and you're going to see some black iron crosses, and they're all around us. There's one here, there's probably some back here. I know there's a bunch of them here, and what that is called the Southern Cross of Honor. and that represents honorable service that this person is buried there, served in the Confederate Army. On some of these stone graves of a Confederate veteran, you'll see that on the top as well, carved in. This was something that was started by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, the monument we're in front of right now is to the memory of Charles Davis. Mr. Davis was born in Vermont in 1796, and by his early 20s he was living here in Walton County. In the early 1820s he got here to Monroe. Now, Mr. Davis was an attorney by trade. He was a state legislator, and he was a landowner. In 1846 he bought the Davis Edwards house over on Broad Street from a fellow by the name of Josiah Clark. Now, he bought the house and 34 acres, and that's where he lived for some time. After the war between the states ended, he was on the Constitutional Convention here in Georgia, and later on in his life, he was a judge for the Western Circuit District Court. When he passed away, he was buried on the family plot, and when some road work was done, they moved his monument over here. Now, it's thought that they did not move the body as well, just the monument. And if that's the case, this is what's known as a centaur. That's a monument for a grave that's not there, just a monument itself. And we're going to see a few of those while we're out here. But right over here, this is the final resting place of little Francis Lanius. Francis died in 1904, was 4 years old, and you'll see the symbolism that's on this monument a lot of times as well. You see the lamb up in the front, which represents innocence, but there's a stump behind it, and you see it's a tree that's been cut, and that represents a life cut short. And you'll see that, you'll see that quite a bit. Now, one of the monuments I think is really one of the more interesting ones here at Rest Haven is the one that we're standing in front of right now, and this is in memory of Matthew Talbot Nunley. Matthew was from here, and in 1859 he got an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. He left that academy in 1861 at the start of the war between the states, and was commissioned a captain in the Confederate Army. He was company commander of Company H of the 11th Georgia Volunteer Infantry, also known as the Walton Volunteers. Now, he was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg at the charge on Devil's Den. He's actually buried up there, and his sister, Mary, who's buried right over here, made an offer to the city of Monroe that she would fund a monument, a memorial monument on the courthouse lawn, and she'd pay for all of it as long as they used her brother's image. Well, they turned that offer down, so she had this monument put out here at Rest Haven. And the thing that I really like about this particular monument, if you look at him, this is an actual image of Captain Nunley, and he's wearing his Confederate uniform. And over the years, mildew has gotten on this monument and turned his tunic Confederate gray. Now, he was in the early 90s, there was a storm that came through Monroe and knocked the monument down, and you can see his hat's broken a little bit, and there was a saber on the left side that's broken off as well. Now, I've heard that he was faced in a different direction beforehand, but when they replaced the monument, he's facing towards the Southlands. If you drive down US 78 between Monroe here and Athens, you'll notice that it's called the Moyna Michael Memorial Highway. Well, we're at the final resting place right now of Moyna Michael. She was also known as the Poppy Lady. She was a teacher by trade. She actually became a teacher when she was 15 years old after she came back from boarding school, and she taught in a log cabin on her father's cotton plantation. After the cotton plantation was sold, they moved up here to Monroe, and she taught here as well. Now, she was an instructor at the University of Georgia, and at the beginning of World War I, she took a leave of absence and went up to New York working for the YMCA Overseas Volunteer Training Program. She worked there throughout the war, and She had read John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields a number of times. This is a poem that talks about those that died in World War I and are buried in Flanders Fields. But 2 days before the armistice, this was on November the 9th, 1918, she read it, and the second half of that poem really got to her. And it's actually on her monument here, and it's to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. And when she read that, she decided right then that from now on she was going to wear a poppy in memory of those who had died in World War I. Well, when she came back to Georgia and was teaching at the university, she taught a class that had a number of disabled veterans from World War I. She realized they still needed help, so she decided to start selling artificial poppies to help raise money, to help in their care. And that's something that really still kind of goes on to some degree today. She got a personal letter from General John Pershing, who was the commander of the expeditionary forces over in during World War I, and thanked her for her patriotism for doing that. And we're going to head right on down this question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The British just did a big commemoration of the poppies all around the thing there, and the other thing that's interesting is that the poppy here, when Price was talking about the lilies of the field, they were poppies.
Is that right?
Yeah, they were little red poppies.
We're at the final resting place right now with General George Justice Hearn, who was known as Bo. He joined the Georgia National Guard in 1925 and served every enlisted rank until he was commissioned to second lieutenant in 1932. General Hearn served on active duty in the Second World War and also during the Korean War. And when he came back to Monroe, Governor Herman Talmadge appointed him as the Adjutant General to the state of Georgia. And 4 additional governors also appointed him, so he had that position from 1954 through 1971. At one time he was the mayor of Monroe, he was the president of the Monroe Golf and Country Club, and he was the commander of the American Legion here in Georgia for a time. He was also instrumental in managing the family business, Hearn Hardware, in downtown Monroe. We're at the final resting place right now of Walter Robeson Cox. Mr. Cox was born in 1929, passed away in 2000. In 1945, he graduated from the Swanee Military Academy, and then in 1950 from the University of the South. Went to work for the Central Intelligence Agency and worked there until his retirement in 1983. Now, he was stationed pretty much all around the world, and at the time that he retired, he was in charge of the Junior Agent Career Program. Now, when he retired and came back to Monroe here, he was instrumental in getting a group together and going all around Walton County looking for old cemeteries and trying to restore them. Our next stop is going to be right here, so we can pretty much probably do it from right here. If y'all want to just hold on, I'm going to walk back here a few steps.
I'm not letting you out of sight.
Now, we're at the final resting place right now of what I consider a real trailblazer. This is Mary Ethel Cresswell, buried here. She was an educator by trade, began teaching in Walton County in 1901, and in 1919 she was the first female ever to receive a baccalaureate degree from the University of Georgia. She was also a charter member of the Phi Beta Phi Honor Society and was the first female to be the president of that group. For a while she worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture up in Washington, and she was their first female supervisor. She was the first dean of the School of Home Economics there at the university, and even after she retired from that position, she continued to teach there for some time. Now, if you're familiar with the University of Georgia, there's a residence hall there called Cresswell Hall. It holds about 1,000 folks there, and it's named in her memory. I think in every cemetery that you come to, you're going to find, if you look around enough, you're going to find some really unusual monuments. And the monument we're at right now, I think is probably one of the more unusual ones here. If you look, there's two headstones here. J.P. Riger is the fellow's name. He was born in 1876 and died in 1948. That's the more recent monument that was put here by a couple of citizens here in Monroe. But the story of him, they called him the Old German. And he wasn't from here. He came from somewhere else and rented rooms here and worked odd jobs. And when he passed away in 1948, there was nobody to claim his body. So the funeral home kept it for a while, and finally the city of Monroe buried him out here at Rest Haven. And the first monument that you see here, the older one, the gravedigger actually put that out here. And the thing I think is pretty unusual about it, it's pretty obviously a homemade monument. It has the Old German was buried here 2/24/1948. German and buried are both misspelled. We're at the Lanius family plot right now. This was a prominent family here in Monroe. And the monument I'm in front of right now is in memory of PFC Harry B. Lanius Jr. Now, Harry was an honor graduate of Monroe High School in 1943 and spent a year at the Citadel before joining the U.S. Army. He was sent overseas, and in January of 1945, he was killed in action at the Battle of the Bulge. Well, his body is there in the Luxembourg Cemetery, and the family put this monument here in his memory. They also had the Memorial Library built over on Bowl Springs Avenue. The building's still there, but the library now is closed. But there's a Harry B. Lanius Jr. chapel at Monroe First United Methodist Church that his family had built. And if you ever go over there, you'll see a portrait of him in his Army uniform. His military medals are on display there, and a picture of the cemetery that he's actually buried in with a snapshot of his actual grave there as well. Now look, if you look at the area that we're in right now, you'll see the monuments look a lot more modern than the ones that we just came from. This was an original part of the cemetery. In fact, at one time it was a memorial park. It was here in memory of Alma Knight Allen. She was a lady who lived here locally, and when she passed away, the park was put here in her memory. And as the cemetery grew, it just came on back this way and sort of took the park over. Now, I understand at one time there was a pond back here, and you can see there's still the wall here and then the gate. So that's I think a pretty interesting part of the cemetery itself. Now, every sports team that there is in the world, there's always a bunch of fans, and there's some real rabid fans. And I tell you right now, we're at the grave of probably the biggest Georgia Bulldogs football fan who ever lived. And if you look right over here, you'll see the Scott Monument. This is the final resting place of Herschel Bulldog Scott. And if you read his headstone, you'll see that he was Georgia born and Georgia bred, and he is lying there right now, Georgia dead. Now, when he was a teenager, on Saturdays he'd get on his bicycle and he'd ride from Monroe to Athens to watch Georgia football games. In the early 60s, as a young man, he started a streak that I don't know will ever be broken. He went to 471 straight Georgia football games, and that includes home, away, and bowl games. He would, I understand that in the phone book he was listed as Mr. Bulldog. He'd walk around town and he'd tell kids, he'd say the magic phrase, and if they said, "How about them dogs?" he'd give them a quarter and a little Georgia card. So he was planting some seeds there. Now, when he passed away, Vince Dooley came to his funeral, and he remembered that Mr. Scott would be at these games, and he'd be there with them as the football team got on the bus, and somehow would get to the hotel before they got there, and he'd be there when they got off. So he was quite the fan. You go to a cemetery, you're going to find heroes buried there. And when I think of heroes, normally what I think of are people who were in the military that did amazingly brave things in very stressful situations. We're at the final resting place right now of a true American hero. This is the final resting place of Victor Franklin Grubbs. Now, he was a military hero. He was a B-17 bomber pilot in World War II. And if you look at the top of his monument, it's got a picture of a little two-seater plane. a B-17, and a Boeing 747. And he became a hero in March of 1977, flying a Boeing 747. He was the captain of the Clipper Victor 747. It was a Pan Am plane. It was a charter, and it was flying from New York over to the Canary Islands. Well, they were going to the Grand Canary Island, but they found out that there was some terrorist activity going on over there, so they were redirected to another one that was close by. Now, it was a one-runway airport, and a number of planes were rerouted that day. In addition to his 747, there was another 747 owned by KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. It was known as the Rhine, and it was there too. Well, when they all were sitting there on that runway waiting for clearance to take off, finally, a few hours later, they were given clearance that they could start moving out. Well, unfortunately, during the time they had been sitting there, a fog had rolled in, and there was no visibility at all. Well, the 747s were the big plane. The Rhine had just refueled because he was going back to Amsterdam. So he was leading the way up that runway, and the Clipper Victor was behind him, further back on the runway. Well, when the Rhine got to the end, he turned around in preparation for takeoff and somehow thought he had been cleared to take off. So he started his roll, and he's rolling down this runway. He can't see anything, but Captain Grubbs was the first one to see something. He saw that plane coming, and when he saw it coming, he turned his plane to the left and revved up those engines and tried to get off the runway to avoid that inevitable crash. Well, at the very last minute, the Rhine's pilot saw what he had done, and he pulled back on his stick trying to avoid the crash. He almost did it, but he took off the top of the Clipper Victor. The Rhine went on down about 500 feet, hit the runway, slid about another 1,000 feet with that full fuel tank, and exploded, killing all 248 people on board. Well, now, if it had not been for Captain Grubbs' heroic efforts trying to get off that runway that day, the 61 people that survived that crash would not have survived. So in my mind, he is a true American hero. 583 people died that day, and to date, that is still the worst air disaster in history. The monument that we're at right now is a memorial to those who gave their lives to make us free in World War II. There are a number of veterans that are buried around that monument. There are also some headstones here for those that never did make it home. My dad was a Second World War veteran, and I know we've got at least one World War veteran here today, and I'm firmly convinced that they did save the world. And so I'm thankful that we have a monument to their memory today. If everybody could just look right back over here, you'll see the Coker plot, Coker family plot. There's 3 footstones there. The 2 stone ones on either side, and the metal one in the middle with an American flag next to it. That's the final resting place of Dennis Coker. Dennis grew up here in Monroe. He went to Monroe Area High School, very involved in extracurricular activities there. He played football. He was number 74 for the Hurricanes. He ran track. He received a scholastic letter. He was a vice president of the science club. He was in the glee club. He was just, I didn't know him, but it sounds like he was just a great kid. Now, he graduated from Monroe in 1963 and enrolled at Georgia Tech. And while he was at Georgia Tech, he was in the Army ROTC program. And upon graduation, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry. Now, he went on to flight school to become a helicopter pilot, stationed first in Texas and later in southeast Georgia. And in late 1968, he was sent to Vietnam. Now, he was stationed with the 1st Aviation Brigade there, and he was stationed southwest of Saigon. He served 6 months in Vietnam, and he was killed in action. And as far as I know, this is the only Vietnam serviceman that's killed in action that's buried here in Rest Haven Cemetery. Now, his awards included the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and he had 21 air medals. 21 air medals. Now, you get those air medals for flying in these combat zones a number of times. So in the 6 months he was there, he flew enough to get that many. Ironically enough, he was not killed in the air. He was killed in a rocket attack on his position there where he was based. Now, I never knew Dennis. I never got the privilege to meet Dennis, but I feel like I have a certain connection with him, because when I did my tour in Vietnam, I also served with the 1st Aviation Brigade. The gravesite we're at right now is the final resting place of Robert Alva Clay, and if you look at his monument here, you'll see that he played all 4 quarters of the game. Now, he was known as the Kid, and he is a member of the Georgia Tech Athletic Hall of Fame. He went to Monroe High School. He finished up at Emory Academy, and in 1910 he enrolled at Georgia Tech and received an engineering degree in 1915 and went to work for Georgia Tech as an instructor in the experimental engineering department. Now, he was also an assistant football coach under John Heisman, who the Heisman Trophy is named after, and he was an assistant baseball coach as well. Now, his career was interrupted by World War I. He was a lieutenant in the Army, served with the 82nd Division in France, and saw action in the Argonne Forest. When he came back home, he went back to work for Georgia Tech, again was the assistant baseball coach, and in 1921 was named the head baseball coach at Georgia Tech, and that was a position he held until 1931. And in 3 of the 11 seasons that he coached the baseball team there, he won conference championships. Now, after he left, he spent some time being the head football coach at Riverside Military Academy up in Gainesville. Now, he died in 1946 of natural causes, ironically, in Monroe, Louisiana. We're on the Mitchum plot right now. We're at the final resting place of Ella Sue Mitchum. Ella Sue was 16 years old when she died on December the 7th, 1946, in the worst hotel fire in U.S. history. She was in the Wynkoff fire downtown Atlanta. Now, she went to Gainesville High School, and her and 3 of her classmates were all elected by the school to represent them to go down to Atlanta to take part in something there at the state capitol, so that the kids around Georgia could get some parliamentary experience. Well, they did stay there. They were in room 1130. Now, they call them the 30 rooms. They were facing south, and they were facing another building, so the windows had louvers in them. So there was really no way to get out. It was advertised as a fireproof hotel. There was no fire escapes. There were no sprinkler systems or any of that thing. And when the fire started, and they believe it did start on her side of the hotel, it burned and spread pretty quickly. And when the Atlanta Fire Department got out there, they found that their equipment could only go up to about the 6th floor. So unfortunately, those that were above there were trapped. And Ella Sue and her 3 friends died of suffocation there in her room. 119 people died in that fire that night. Of the 40 children that had come to Atlanta or had gone to Atlanta to take part in this thing, 30 of them passed away. So she's buried here because this is her hometown. Her 3 friends are all buried up in Gainesville, Georgia. If y'all see this monument right here, the Greer Monument, you have Joseph K. Greer and his wife, Bessie Moore Greer. They operated, I understand, a boarding house here in Monroe, and they had a son. His name was Joseph K. Greer Jr. He grew up here. He went to Monroe High School, went to Emory at Oxford, and finished up at Furman University, and then took some graduate classes at the University of North Carolina. Now, he was drafted into the Army Air Corps during World War II as a private, served on active duty in World War II and also in the Korean War, and came out a major. Now, originally he wanted to be an architect, but he decided he'd like to move inside and he became an interior decorator and interior designer. As it turns out, a world-renowned interior decorator. He decorated parts of the White House for the Eisenhowers, the Kennedys, and the Johnsons. Some of his client list included Joan Fontaine, and Mary Martin and Ethel Merman. Now later on in his life, when he had become pretty famous, he decided to change his name to Joseph Michael Greer. He lived in New York City and was found in the late 70s murdered in his apartment there, and his remains were cremated and buried between his parents here at Rest Haven. We're at the final resting place right now of Ernest Camp Sr. He and his wife and infant child came to Monroe in 1906 and bought the then 6-year-old Walton Tribune. Also bought the Walton Press, and the family owned the Walton Tribune for 70 years. It was sold in 1976, and the press, with the Walton Press, was also sold later on. The family house was downtown. If you know where the Hardys is, kind of across the street from the Methodist Church, that's where their house was. Now, in 1912, he was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention that nominated Woodrow Wilson as president, and in 1932 held that position again when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nominated for president. Now he was a poet. He published a couple of books of poems. He was the poet laureate of the Georgia Press Association and was also a president of that organization as well. Now he is a member of the Henry Grady School of Journalism Hall of Fame there at the University of Georgia. He had 3 children, Ernest Jr., Martha, and then Sanders. And Sanders is buried right back over here. And he's actually our next person. Sanders graduated from Monroe High School in the late 20s, and he graduated from Georgia Tech in the early 30s. Went into the Army and served in World War II as an artillery officer. He was in the China-Burma-India campaign. After the war was over, he was a member of the OSS for a couple of years, which is now the Central Intelligence Agency. He came back to town and joined the National Guard and rose in ranks there. And in 1963, he retired as a brigadier general out of the Georgia National Guard. Now, I understand that he and General Hearn were very good friends. He was also the president of the Georgia Press Association and is a member of the Georgia School of Journalism Hall of Fame. This is the only father-son team that have ever done that. Our next stop is this older monument right here. Now this monument here is in memory of Orion Stroud and his first wife Milka. It actually hasn't always been here. They were buried in the Stroud family cemetery close by here, but in the 1940s some of the family decided it would be better taken care of if it were moved over here to Rest Haven. So the monument was moved over here, and 2 shovels full of dirt from the grave sites were brought over here as well. Now Milka died early, so Orion remarried. They had a daughter, and the daughter married in to the Nunley family. The second wife is buried down at the Old Baptist Cemetery. Now this, although it's not in a Victorian kind of area here in the cemetery, it's a Victorian monument, and there is symbolism here. If you look at the corner of this monument, you'll see upside down torches, and that represents a life snuffed out. Now Mr. Stroud at one time was like the 2nd largest landowner here in Walton County. He owned about 2,600 acres over around where US 78 is. He was a state legislator. He was a judge as well. And actually this is the great-great-grandfather of my friend Sidney Cooper. This is a short stop here. We're just going to take one last look at Victorian symbolism here on the tour. If you look at the Durden Monument, you'll see a palm branch above the name. And that palm branch represents spiritual victory over death. If you walk around the cemetery, you'll see that a number of different places. Now, Monroe is known as the city of governors. It's known that because there were 6 Georgia governors that had some connection to the city, and also 1 Texas governor. And I tell you this because we're at the final resting place right now of Governor Henry McDaniel. Governor McDaniel was from here. He went to Mercer University, where his father had been a professor at one time, and got his law degree, and came back here to Monroe and practiced law with his uncle. Now, he was the youngest delegate to the secession convention in Milledgeville as the war between the states was about to kick off. Originally, he voted against secession, but before the convention was over, he voted for. And of course, that was when Georgia seceded from the Union. Now, Governor McDaniel practiced what he preached because he joined the Confederate Army, and he was a lieutenant serving under Captain Nunley right over here. He was there at the Battle of Gettysburg that day. Now, while this was going on, it became very obvious that he was a great leader because as his officers were killed, he ended up taking command of the unit. Now, about 8 days after the Battle of Gettysburg, when the Confederate Army was withdrawing, he was shot in the stomach at the fighting of Funkstown, Maryland, and spent the rest of the war in hospitals and also in a prisoner of war camp in Ohio. When the war ended, he came out a major. Now, he's buried next to the love of his life, Hester Felker. Now, while he was in the prisoner of war camp, he wrote her love letters, and for some reason, her father didn't particularly like Henry McDaniel. Don't really know why. I think probably most of us who are fathers understand that nobody's really good enough for our little girls. And I guess that's kind of what he thought. But when he came back to town, he swept her off her feet, and they married, and their marriage lasted 60 years. So I like to think that Mr. Felker realized that he was wrong about Henry McDaniel. Now, he went into politics and served the State House of Representatives and later on in the State Senate. And when Governor Alexander Stephens passed away in office, a special election was held, and Henry McDaniel was elected governor to finish out that term. He was re-elected and served his own term as governor. While he was governor, he saw the opening of Georgia Tech and the beginning of the building of the state capitol. And when he came back to Monroe after retirement, he practiced law, took care of his business interests, and lived at the McDaniel-Tishner house over on McDaniel Street. Just a couple down from him is Gypsy McDaniel-Tishner. And she was their daughter. This is her husband buried next to her. The Tishners lived across the street from her parents, and when the McDaniels passed away, they moved into the McDaniel-Tishner house, and that's why it's called the McDaniel-Tishner house. The family actually stayed in that house until the early 90s. So we're awfully honored to have a governor buried here in the cemetery here locally. Now, folks, that wraps up our tour of the cemetery today. I hope y'all have enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed giving it to you. One of the really neat things about living here in Monroe is I know so many people that knew a lot of the people that were on these tours, you know, and I've heard that there's some relatives out here today too. So for those of you who are relatives of the one that were on the tour, I hope that I've honored them with what I've talked about. Now, one final thing I would like to say is when I was 12 years old, my grandfather died. And it was the first time anybody close to me had ever died. And I remember my mother telling me at his funeral, as long as you remember him, he's not really dead. And I really believe that. I do. So I hope y'all will come out here sometimes and just walk around this cemetery and see the names and remember the folks. Folks, thanks for coming out. I hope y'all will consider joining the Historical Society. I think we may have some applications over here, so we'd love to have you. And thanks for coming. Y'all come back and see us again.